I built that mansion with my own hands and 16 years of sleepless nights. Every marble tile, every chandelier, every purple flower in the garden was chosen for one person, my daughter. But the day I finally came home, I didn't find her living like the queen of that house. I found her on her knees, scrubbing the floors like a maid in the very mansion I had given her. And the moment she looked up at me, my own daughter didn't even recognize me. That was the moment I calmly reached for my phone and called my lawyer. What happened after that call would destroy a lie that had been living inside my house for years. But before I tell you what happened next, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Stories like this remind us that patience, truth, and courage can change a woman's life in ways she never imagined. Now let me tell you how everything began. My name is Margaret Lawson. I'm 64 years old, and for 16 years I lived thousands of miles away from home. I wasn't on vacation. I was building something. I was working in the international hospitality industry, managing luxury hotels in London, Dubai, and Singapore. 16-hour days, endless meetings, rooms full of executives who didn't think a woman should be leading them. But I stayed because every contract I signed, every promotion I fought for, every night I worked while others slept had one purpose. My daughter Alina Lawson, is my only child. She is 32 now, though the last time I hugged her in person, she was still a young woman with bright ideas and a fearless smile. Alina always loved design. When she was little, she used to rearrange furniture in our tiny apartment like she was preparing a palace for royalty. She would say, "Mama, one day I'm going to design beautiful places where people feel happy the moment they walk in." So I promised her something when she was 18. I promised that one day she would have a place of her own, a place no one could take away from her. And that promise became the reason I worked for 16 years across the world. By the time Alina turned 25, I had built enough wealth to make that promise real. I purchased a beautiful estate just outside the city, a $5 million mansion surrounded by tall trees and lavender gardens. I remember the day I gave it to her. She cried so hard she could barely speak. "Mama, this is too much," she kept saying, but to me it wasn't too much, it was protection. I had grown up watching women lose everything because they depended on someone else's kindness. Husbands changed, families betrayed each other, money disappeared. I never wanted Alina to live with that fear. So I gave her the house legally in her name, completely hers. At least that's what everyone believed. But there was something no one knew except one other person. My lawyer, Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan Pierce is not just an attorney. He's a careful man who has spent 30 years protecting people from the kind of mistakes emotions can cause. When I told him I wanted to transfer the mansion to Alina, he asked me a strange question. "Margaret," he said, "are you sure you want to give someone complete control over something this valuable without protection?" At the time, I laughed. "She's my daughter, Jonathan." But he insisted on building something into the documents. A legal safeguard? A quiet clause designed to activate only if Alina's safety or rights were ever threatened. I signed those papers thinking we would never need them. After that, life moved forward. Alina started her design studio. She sent me pictures of the projects she worked on. Cafes, boutique stores, small hotels. Her smile in those photos told me she was happy. Then 3 years later, she told me she had met someone, Victor Hale. Victor was charming. Successful, confident. At least that's how he appeared when I spoke with him on video calls. Alina sounded happy, so I accepted him. Because when your child loves someone, you want to believe they are safe. Victor came with someone else too. His aunt, Diana Hale. Diana was elegant in a way that made people uncomfortable. She spoke politely, but there was always something cold hiding behind her smile. Still, I convinced myself I was imagining things. After all, I was thousands of miles away. What right did I have to judge people I barely knew? Then the calls from Alina slowly became shorter, then they became less frequent. Then sometimes weeks would pass without hearing from her. I told myself she was busy, running a business, building a marriage, living her life. But something inside me kept whispering that something wasn't right. A mother's instinct doesn't disappear just because there's an ocean between you and your child. Finally, this year, I decided it was time to come home. Not for a visit, for good. I didn't tell Alina. I wanted to surprise her. I imagined her opening the door, screaming my name, running into my arms like she did when she was little. I imagined laughter filling the hallways of the mansion I built for her. I imagined finally resting after 16 years of fighting the world. Instead, the moment I arrived at the gate, something felt wrong. The garden was neglected. The purple flowers Alina loved had dried into brown patches of soil. The windows were open, but the house felt strangely quiet. Then I walked toward the side window, and that's when I saw her. My daughter, Alina Lawson, on her knees, scrubbing the marble floors. At first I told myself it couldn't be her. The woman looked thinner, older somehow, like someone who had forgotten how to stand tall. Her hair was tied back in a loose knot. Her clothes were faded and worn, and the way she moved slowly, carefully, as if every movement had to be approved by someone else. My heart started beating so hard I could hear it in my ears. I pushed open the gate and walked up the path. Through the window I could see two other people in the room. Victor Hale, my son-in-law, lying comfortably on the sofa watching television. And beside him sat Diana Hale, his aunt, sipping tea like she owned the place. Alina was cleaning the floor only a few feet away from them. They didn't even look at her. The door wasn't locked. I walked inside quietly. The first sound they heard was the echo of my heels on the marble floor. Victor looked up first. Confusion crossed his face. Diana slowly lowered her teacup. Alina turned her head last. Our eyes met. I waited for recognition, for joy, for anything that would tell me my daughter knew who I was. Instead, she looked at me like I was a stranger who had walked into the wrong house. And that was the moment I understood something terrible had happened while I was gone. Victor stood up with a forced smile. "You must be Margaret," he said casually. "Alina's mother." Must be. Those two words told me everything about the kind of man he was. I looked at my daughter again. She lowered her eyes immediately, like she was afraid to hold my gaze too long. And that was when I noticed something else. Her hands were shaking, not from cleaning, from fear. So I did the one thing years of business negotiations had taught me to do when someone thinks they have control. I stayed calm, I smiled politely, and I said 4 quiet words. "Hello, I'm finally home." But inside my mind, I had already started planning the move that would change everything in that house. Because what Victor Hale didn't know was that the mansion he thought he owned had a secret written into its foundation. In the moment I made one phone call, his entire world was about to collapse. And the person who would answer that call was already on their way. When Victor Hale looked at me standing in that living room, he smiled the way men do when they believe they are still in control of the room. But I've spent 40 years sitting across tables from powerful men who thought the same thing. Confidence is easy to fake when the truth hasn't walked in yet. I slowly set my suitcase down beside the doorway and looked around the mansion I had built for my daughter. The white marble floors were exactly the way I remembered. The tall windows still let in the warm afternoon sunlight. The chandelier above the living room glowed softly like nothing had changed. But something had changed, something human, something cruel. My daughter Alina Lawson, my child, was still standing there holding a mop like she didn't know whether she was allowed to move. Victor cleared his throat and walked toward me with the exaggerated politeness of someone pretending to be welcoming. "Margaret, right?" he said smoothly. "Alina told me you might come visit someday." Someday, that word slid through the room like a quiet insult. I nodded calmly. Yes. Someday arrived earlier than expected. Behind him, Diana Hale, Victor's aunt, sat comfortably in the armchair near the window. Diana Hale was 61, elegant, composed, and colder than winter marble. She looked at me over the rim of her teacup the way someone studies a stranger who has interrupted their afternoon routine. "Well," she said slowly, "this is certainly a surprise." I turned my eyes back to Alina. "Hello, sweetheart?" Alina flinched slightly at the word sweetheart. That small reaction stabbed deeper than any insult Victor or Diana could have delivered. She lowered her head quickly and whispered, "Hello." Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered. That frightened me more than anything else in the room. Victor noticed the silence stretching between us and laughed lightly. "Alina's been busy today. Housekeeping never ends in a place this big." Housekeeping. I repeated the word quietly inside my head. Housekeeping in her own home. I walked further into the living room, my heels echoing softly across the floor Alina had just cleaned. "I didn't realize my daughter had hired herself as the maid," I said calmly. Victor's smile tightened slightly. Diana placed her teacup down with precise elegance. "Margaret," she said, "running a home requires discipline. Alina prefers to stay productive. I watched Alina carefully. Her shoulders were tense. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. It looked less like productivity and more like obedience. I had seen that posture before. Years ago when I worked in Dubai, one of the hotel housekeepers used to stand exactly like that when her supervisor was nearby. Careful, quiet, invisible. My stomach tightened. But anger is loud, and loud emotions are easy for manipulative people to control. So I did the opposite. I smiled. "Victor," I said politely, "it's been years since we've properly met. You must show me how things are going here." Victor seemed relieved by my calm tone. "Of course," he said quickly, "everything is running perfectly." "Good," I replied. "Then you won't mind if I look around." Before he could answer, I walked slowly across the room. Alina instinctively moved aside like someone who had learned to make space for others. That movement alone told me more about her life than any explanation could have. As I passed her, I noticed something else. The skin on her hands was rough and cracked, not the hands of a woman who ran a design studio. The hands of someone who spent hours scrubbing and cleaning. My heart tightened, but my face remained calm. I stepped into the hallway and looked around. The paintings I had chosen were still there. The marble staircase curved upward just the way I remembered. But something was missing, something important. The laughter that used to echo through this house when Alina first moved in. I turned back toward the living room. "Alina," I said gently, "why don't you sit down? We can talk." Victor answered before she could speak. "She still has work to finish." The words were casual, but the authority behind them was unmistakable. Alina froze again. I looked directly at Victor. "Work can wait." Diana leaned forward slightly. "In this house, Margaret, we believe responsibilities come first." I studied her carefully. Diana Hale wasn't just observing this situation. She was controlling it. Interesting. I had spent my entire career studying power dynamics: who speaks first, who interrupts, who controls the conversation. Diana had been orchestrating this household for a long time. Alina whispered softly, "It's okay, Mama, I can finish quickly." Mama, the word nearly broke my composure. She hadn't called me that in years. But the way she said it, carefully, almost fearfully, made my chest ache. Victor clapped his hands lightly. "See, she doesn't mind." That was the moment I understood something very important. Alina wasn't working because she wanted to, she was working because she believed she had no choice. I walked slowly to the window and looked outside toward the garden. That's when I saw a familiar figure near the back gate. An older man trimming hedges. Luis Romero. Mr. Luis Romero had worked on the estate grounds since the mansion was built. He had been here longer than Victor, longer than Diana. Loyal people like Luis notice things others miss. Our eyes met briefly through the glass. For a second he froze, then recognition spread across his face. His expression changed instantly from surprise to something else. Relief. That reaction told me more than words ever could. Luis knew something was wrong here. I turned back to the room slowly. Victor was watching me closely now. The polite host mask had begun to crack slightly. "You must be tired after such a long trip," he said. "Why don't you rest in the guest room tonight?" Guest room, I almost laughed. This man was offering me a guest room inside the house I had built. "Thank you," I said calmly, "but before I rest, I'd like to understand something." Victor crossed his arms slightly. "What's that? Why my daughter is cleaning floors in a $5 million house she owns?" Silence filled the room instantly. Diana's eyes narrowed. Victor's smile disappeared. Alina's grip tightened on the mop handle. Victor spoke carefully. "Margaret, Alina actually transferred the house to me 3 years ago." The sentence landed like a stone in still water. I tilted my head slightly. "She did?" Victor nodded confidently. "Of course, completely legal. Signed and notarized." I slowly looked at Alina. "Is that true?" Alina's lips parted slightly, but no words came out. Her eyes flickered nervously toward Victor, then toward Diana, and that was the moment I knew the truth. Fear had been living in this house longer than I had been gone. Victor stepped forward. "You see, everything is perfectly legitimate." I nodded slowly. "I'm sure it is." Then I reached calmly into my handbag and pulled out my phone. Victor frowned slightly. "Who are you calling?" I looked directly into his eyes. "The only man who knows the full story of this house." His expression shifted, slightly, just enough. And who would that be? I dialed the number without breaking eye contact. The phone rang once, twice. Then a familiar voice answered. Jonathan Pierce speaking. Jonathan Pierce, my lawyer, 58 years old, the man who had written the original property documents 16 years ago. The only other person who knew about the protective clause hidden inside that deed. I spoke quietly but clearly. Jonathan, it's Margaret, I'm at the house. There was a short pause on the line. Then Jonathan said something that made the corner of my mouth lift slightly. Good, he replied calmly. I've been waiting for this call for years. Across the room, Victor's confident posture shifted for the first time since I arrived. And that was the moment I knew something important. The lie that had been running this house was finally about to meet the truth. But what Victor Hale didn't know yet was that he wasn't the only one who had been planning things for years. And the next person who was about to walk through that door would bring answers that no one in that room was ready to hear. The moment I ended the call with Jonathan Pierce, the room felt different. Silence spread across the living room like a slow storm rolling in. Victor Hale stood in the center of the room with his arms crossed, trying to maintain the confident posture he had been wearing since I walked through the door. But confidence has a fragile foundation when it's built on lies. I've seen that look before. Men in boardrooms used to look exactly like that when they realized the negotiation was no longer going their way. After 16 years working overseas in the hospitality industry, I learned something very important about power. The loudest person in the room is rarely the one who actually has it. So instead of arguing, I did something that made Victor far more uncomfortable. I sat down, slowly, calmly, right there on the sofa he had been lounging on minutes earlier. I placed my handbag beside me and looked at Alina. My daughter still hadn't moved. She stood near the window gripping the mop handle like it was the only thing keeping her upright. Alina Lawson, my daughter, the girl who once redesigned our tiny apartment furniture every weekend just for fun, looked like a stranger in her own house. That hurt more than anything Victor or Diana had said. Diana Hale finally broke the silence. She leaned back in her chair with a thin smile that never reached her eyes. Margaret, she said smoothly, I'm sure your lawyer friend is a very capable man. But bringing legal drama into a family home seems unnecessary. I smiled politely. Unnecessary things rarely bother honest people. Victor shifted his weight slightly, just slightly, but I noticed. Diana noticed too. Alina's eyes flickered toward me for a moment, as if she couldn't quite believe I was still sitting there so calmly. Victor walked toward the cabinet beside the fireplace. Since we're discussing legal matters, he said casually, perhaps we should clear something up. He opened the cabinet and pulled out a folder, a familiar manila folder. These are the documents Alina signed 3 years ago, he said, placing them on the coffee table in front of me. The deed transfer, completely legitimate. I looked at the folder but didn't open it immediately. Instead, I turned to Alina. Did you know he kept these papers right here in the living room? Alina looked down at the floor again. Her silence answered the question for me. Victor tapped the folder lightly with his finger. Go ahead, he said with a confident smile. Take a look. I finally opened the folder. The document inside was exactly what he said it was. A property transfer form. The house, my house, transferred from Alina Lawson to Victor Hale. The signature at the bottom read Alina Lawson. At first glance, it looked real. But there are certain details people forget when they try to recreate the truth. I leaned forward slightly and examined the paper more closely. The ink, the spacing, the pressure marks. My entire career had been built on noticing small details. Contracts, agreements, numbers that didn't quite add up. And the moment I saw Alina's signature, I knew something was wrong. I looked up slowly. Victor was watching me closely now. Diana's expression had grown sharper. They were both waiting for me to react. But reacting is exactly what manipulative people expect. Instead, I closed the folder again. Interesting, I said calmly. Victor smiled. I thought you'd agree. I shook my head slightly. No, interesting because this signature doesn't look like my daughter's handwriting. The air in the room shifted again. Victor's smile stiffened. Of course it is, he said quickly. She signed it herself. I looked at Alina again. Did you? Alina's lips trembled slightly. She opened her mouth, then stopped. Diana leaned forward immediately. Margaret, Alina was ill at the time. She had a severe infection. Her hands were shaking. That's why the signature looks different. That word hung in the air like a warning bell. I had spent 16 years managing international operations worth millions of dollars. Illness during legal transactions is something lawyers pay very close attention to. Slowly, I reached into my bag and pulled out my phone again. Victor frowned. "Calling your lawyer already?" I looked directly at him. "No. Just checking something?" I typed quickly. A message appeared on the screen. Sophie Bennett. Sophie Bennett is 42 years old and one of the best forensic accountants in the country. She had helped my company track down millions of dollars in financial fraud years ago. I had contacted her 2 days before returning home, just in case. My message to her had been simple. Review everything connected to the Lawson estate. She had replied with one sentence earlier that morning. Something is very wrong with those property records. Now I looked back up at Victor. "Tell me something," I said calmly. "After Alina transferred the house to you, what happened to her design studio?" Alina's head snapped up slightly. Victor hesitated, only for a second. "The studio closed," he said casually. "Business failure." I nodded slowly. "And the money from the property income?" Diana frowned. "What property income?" I leaned back in the sofa. "The estate has been generating rental revenue from the guest cottages for years. Nearly $200,000 annually." Victor's expression changed just slightly, but it was enough. "That money was invested," he said quickly. "For the family?" I smiled again. "Of course it was." Just then, something unexpected happened. The back door opened quietly. All four of us turned at the same time. Standing in the doorway was Mr. Luis Romero. Luis Romero had worked on this property for almost 20 years. 55 years old, quiet, loyal, and observant. He stepped into the room slowly. His eyes met mine. "Mrs. Lawson," he said softly. "You're finally home." Victor turned sharply. "Louis, this isn't your business." Louis didn't look at him. He kept his eyes on me. "Ma'am, I think you should see something." My heart beat a little faster. "What is it?" Louis hesitated, then reached into his jacket pocket. He pulled out a small flash drive. "Security footage," he said quietly. Victor's face drained of color instantly. Diana stood up from her chair. "What footage?" Louis looked directly at Victor now. "The footage from the night Alina signed those papers." The room went completely still. Alina looked up at Louis with wide eyes. Victor stepped forward angrily. "You had no right to access those cameras." Louis shrugged slightly. "Actually, I installed them." I stood slowly. My pulse was steady, but something inside me had already started to shift. Because if there was footage, then the truth was about to become impossible to hide. I turned toward Victor one last time. His confident smile was gone now, completely gone, and that's when I realized something important. The lies inside this house had survived for 3 years, but they were only seconds away from collapsing. Because the moment my lawyer Jonathan Pierce arrived, and the moment Sophie Bennett opened those financial records, and the moment we all watched that security footage together, Victor Hale's version of the story would fall apart piece by piece. And what that footage revealed would explain exactly how my daughter lost everything inside her own home. But the truth hidden inside that flash drive was far worse than I had imagined. The moment Luis Romero held up that small flash drive, the air inside the living room felt heavier than before. For 3 years, this house had been operating under a carefully constructed lie. And now, standing in the middle of the same room I had built for my daughter, I could feel that lie beginning to crack. I have spent most of my life studying people. Negotiations, power, deception. There is always a moment when the truth starts pushing its way through the surface. This was that moment. Victor Hale stepped forward immediately, his calm facade collapsing faster than he could rebuild it. "That footage is private property," he snapped, his voice sharper than it had been all evening. "Louis, you have no right to show anyone anything from my security system." Luis Romero didn't move. For 20 years, he had taken care of this estate. Quietly, respectfully, but loyalty has a strange way of shifting when someone finally sees the truth standing in front of them. He looked directly at Victor. "Those cameras were installed before you ever moved into this house," Louis said calmly. "Mrs. Lawson paid for them, I maintain them." That small detail changed the entire balance of the room. Diana Hale stood up slowly from her chair, smoothing the sleeve of her elegant jacket like she was trying to control the situation again. Diana had always been the quiet strategist in this household. While Victor used charm and intimidation, Diana preferred something colder, calculated manipulation. She walked toward the coffee table where the flash drive rested in Louis's hand. "Louis," she said softly, "you've always been a good employee. Don't ruin that reputation by involving yourself in matters that don't concern you." Louis didn't respond immediately. Instead, he looked at Alina. My daughter was standing near the window, her hands trembling at her sides. For 3 years she had been taught to stay silent, to obey, to disappear. But the moment Louis looked at her, something changed in her expression. Not strength yet, but something close to it. Louis finally spoke again. "It concerns me when I see someone treated like a servant in the house she owns." The words landed like a hammer. Alina's breath caught. Victor's eyes darkened instantly. "She doesn't own this house," Victor said coldly. "She signed it over." I stepped forward slowly. "Then the footage shouldn't be a problem." Victor turned toward me sharply. "Margaret, this is ridiculous. We're not turning my living room into some courtroom drama." I smiled faintly. "That's exactly what it already is." Silence stretched across the room. Outside the large windows, the sun was beginning to set. The golden light that once made this house feel warm now cast long shadows across the marble floor. Louis placed the flash drive carefully on the coffee table. "This footage was recorded 3 years ago," he said quietly. "The night Alina signed those documents." My pulse remained steady, but inside my mind everything sharpened. Every negotiation I had ever handled, every investigation I had ever overseen. My instincts were telling me something very important. Victor didn't want us to see that footage, which meant that whatever was on it would explain everything. Just then, the sound of a car pulling into the driveway echoed through the open hallway. Victor's head snapped toward the front door. I didn't need to check to know who had arrived. Jonathan Pierce had always been punctual. Moments later, the door opened and Jonathan stepped inside. At 58 years old, Jonathan Pierce carried himself with the quiet confidence of a man who had spent decades dismantling lies in courtrooms. He looked around the room once, taking in the tension instantly. "Margaret," he said calmly, "I came as quickly as I could." I gestured toward the living room. "Perfect timing." Victor let out an irritated laugh. "You actually brought your lawyer into this?" Jonathan placed his briefcase on the table and opened it slowly. From the tone of Margaret's call, he said evenly, it sounded like legal clarification might be necessary. Diana crossed her arms. "There's nothing to clarify. Alina willingly transferred the property to Victor." Jonathan looked at her briefly, then at the folder containing the deed transfer. "Yes," he said thoughtfully, "I saw that document on my way in." Victor's confidence returned slightly. "Then you know it's legitimate." Jonathan smiled politely. "That depends." The room froze again. Victor frowned. "Depends on what?" Jonathan placed a second document on the table. A thick, notarized contract I recognized instantly. "Depends on whether the protective clause Mrs. Lawson authorized 16 years ago has been triggered." Victor blinked. "Protective clause?" Alina looked up suddenly. "What clause?" I stepped closer to her and placed a gentle hand on her shoulder. "Something I asked Jonathan to include when I gave you the house." Jonathan continued calmly. "The Lawson estate was transferred to Alina with one condition. If ownership was ever transferred under coercion, manipulation, or during a period of medical incapacity, the transfer becomes legally void." Victor's face lost its color again. "That's absurd," he said quickly. "She signed voluntarily." Jonathan nodded slightly. "Then I'm sure the security footage Louis mentioned will confirm that." Every pair of eyes in the room turned back toward the flash drive. Victor stepped forward quickly. "That footage proves nothing." But his voice had already changed. The certainty was gone. Louis walked toward the television mounted on the wall. He inserted the flash drive into the media port beneath the screen. Alina's breathing grew shallow beside me. "Mama, what if?" she whispered. I squeezed her hand gently. "Truth doesn't need to be afraid." The television flickered to life. The screen filled with black and white security footage. The date appeared in the corner, 3 years ago, the same night Alina had supposedly signed away the house. The living room appeared on the screen exactly as it looked now. Alina sat on the sofa, pale, weak, barely able to sit upright. Victor stood beside her holding a stack of papers. Diana stood behind her chair. My heart tightened as the footage continued. Victor placed a pen in Alina's hand. Even on the grainy video, I could see her hesitation. Her hand shook. Then Victor leaned down and whispered something in her ear. Alina flinched. Slowly, painfully, she signed the document. Then the camera captured something else. Something Victor had never expected anyone to see. As Alina tried to stand, she nearly collapsed. Diana stepped forward immediately and grabbed her arm hard. Victor snatched the papers from her hand and smiled. There, his voice echoed faintly from the recording. Now everything belongs to us. The footage ended. The room went completely silent. No one moved. Victor looked like someone had pulled the ground out from under him. Jonathan Pierce closed his briefcase slowly. Well, he said calmly, I believe that answers our question. Victor's entire scheme had just been exposed in a matter of seconds. But what none of us realized yet was that the financial investigation Sophie Bennett had been conducting would reveal something even more shocking than the stolen house. Because Victor Hale hadn't just taken control of the mansion. He had been draining money from the estate for years, and the amount he stole was far larger than anyone in that room was prepared to hear. The television screen went dark, but the silence it left behind felt louder than anything I had heard all evening. For 3 years, Victor Hale had built his control over this house on a lie. And now that lie had just been exposed in front of everyone who mattered. I have learned something over decades of negotiations and investigations. When a lie collapses, people reveal their true selves very quickly. Victor was the first to react. He laughed, not a confident laugh, a desperate one. That video proves nothing, he said quickly, pointing toward the screen as if the footage might disappear if he talked fast enough. She was sick that night. She asked me to help her with paperwork. Jonathan Pierce closed his briefcase calmly, the way a man does when the case he expected has already been proven. Mr. Hale, Jonathan said evenly, that footage shows Alina signing under visible physical distress while you and your aunt pressured her. Under the loss in property clause, that automatically invalidates the transfer. Victor's face hardened. That clause isn't enforceable. Jonathan raised an eyebrow slightly. It was drafted by 3 real estate attorneys and notarized under state law. I assure you it is very enforceable. For the first time since I arrived, Victor had no quick response. Diana Hale stepped forward instead. She had been quiet since the video ended, but the cold calculation had returned to her eyes. Even if the property transfer is challenged, she said smoothly, that doesn't change the financial arrangements already made. That sentence caught my attention immediately. I tilted my head slightly. Financial arrangements? Diana smiled thinly. Victor and Alina have been managing the estate income for years. The guest cottages alone generate a significant amount of revenue. I folded my hands calmly. Yes, they do, Victor crossed his arms. So even if you try to challenge the deed, you're too late to undo everything. I didn't answer immediately. Instead, I reached into my handbag again and pulled out my phone. Because there was one more piece of this story that Victor didn't know yet. Earlier that day, I had received a message. A message from someone who had spent the last 48 hours analyzing every financial record connected to this estate. Her name is Sophie Bennett. Sophie Bennett is 42 years old, one of the sharpest forensic accountants I've ever worked with, and the woman who once helped my company recover nearly $8 million in corporate fraud. When Sophie tells me something is wrong with financial records, I listen. My phone vibrated softly in my hand as if answering my thoughts. A message appeared on the screen. She's here, almost on cue. The doorbell rang. Victor frowned. Who is that now? I slipped my phone back into my bag. Someone who studies numbers better than anyone I know. Jonathan smiled slightly, already understanding. Luis Romero went to open the door. Moments later, a woman stepped into the living room carrying a slim laptop bag and a stack of folders. Sophie Bennett looked exactly the way I remembered, sharp eyes, composed posture, and the quiet focus of someone who had already solved the puzzle before entering the room. Margaret, she said with a small nod. I came as soon as I finished reviewing the records. Victor looked from Sophie to me with visible irritation. And who exactly is this? Sophie answered before I could. Sophie Bennett. Financial investigator, Diana's expression darkened. You had no right to access our accounts. Sophie tilted her head slightly. Actually, the estate's financial records are public through several property filings. And once Mrs. Lawson authorized my review, the trail was surprisingly easy to follow. Victor's jaw tightened. There's no trail. Sophie set her laptop on the table and opened it calmly. That's where you're wrong. The screen lit up with spreadsheets and bank records. Even from across the room, I could see the long list of transactions. Sophie turned the laptop so everyone could see. Over the past 3 years, she said evenly, the guest cottages on this estate generated approximately $640,000 in rental income. Alina's eyes widened slightly beside me. She looked confused. Victor told me the cottages weren't making money anymore. Sophie glanced at her kindly. They've been fully booked most seasons. I looked at Victor. Where did the money go? Victor laughed again, but it sounded hollow now. Business investments? Sophie clicked another file open. That's interesting, because according to these transfers, the money wasn't invested. The room grew quiet again. Sophie zoomed in on a list of transactions. Most of the funds were moved to a private account under Victor Hale's name. Diana stepped forward angrily. That's completely legal. Sophie nodded slightly. Possibly, but the spending pattern is unusual. She opened another page. Luxury car payments, private club memberships, offshore transfers. My eyes narrowed slightly as the numbers appeared one after another. Nearly $500,000 gone. Alina looked like she had stopped breathing. Victor, you said we were struggling? Victor's voice rose sharply. We were. Sophie shook her head. No, the estate was extremely profitable. Then she opened the final document. But this is where things become serious. Everyone leaned closer. Sophie turned the screen again so we could see clearly. Because 2 months ago, Victor Hale attempted to secure a loan using this mansion as collateral. My stomach went cold. Victor shouted immediately, "That's normal business." Sophie's voice remained calm. "Except the property isn't legally yours to use as collateral." Jonathan Pierce closed the file in front of him slowly. Which means that loan application could qualify as financial fraud. Victor's entire posture collapsed slightly. Alina whispered beside me, "You were going to mortgage the house?" Victor didn't answer her. Diana tried one last time to control the situation. "This is ridiculous. None of this proves criminal intent." Sophie closed the laptop calmly. "Actually, it does." She slid a printed document across the table toward Jonathan. Because Victor didn't just apply for the loan. Jonathan read the page silently, then looked up slowly. He signed preliminary approval documents yesterday. The room froze again. Victor had been planning to take a loan against the house that wasn't legally his, while Alina was still living in it. If that loan had gone through, Alina would have lost everything permanently. I turned slowly toward Victor. For the first time since I walked into the house, I let my calm expression fade just slightly. "You weren't just stealing from my daughter," I said quietly. "You were preparing to erase her completely." Victor looked trapped now. Completely trapped? But what he didn't know yet was that Sophie Bennett had discovered something even worse buried inside those financial records. Something that didn't just involve stolen money. Something that could bring the police to this house before the night was over. And the moment Sophie revealed the final transaction she had found, Victor Hale's life would change forever. When Sophie Bennett said there was something worse hidden in the financial records, the entire room seemed to lean toward her at once. I have watched many people try to escape consequences by pretending the numbers will never be examined closely. But numbers are stubborn things. They don't lie, they don't forget, and when someone like Sophie Bennett starts following them, they always lead somewhere. Victor Hale knew it too. I could see it in the tightness of his jaw and the way his eyes kept shifting between Sophie's laptop and the front door like he was calculating how quickly he could leave the room. Alina stood beside me, completely still. For years, she had been made to feel small inside this house, but now the truth was beginning to stand up around her like walls finally rising. Sophie slowly opened another file on her laptop. "There's one more transaction we need to talk about," she said calmly. Victor forced a laugh again. "You've already shown your little spreadsheets. None of this proves anything illegal." Sophie didn't react to the insult. She simply turned the laptop so everyone could see the screen. 2 weeks ago, she said, a wire transfer was scheduled from Victor Hale's private account. I leaned slightly closer to the screen. A number appeared there. $800,000. Alina gasped softly, even Victor's face twitched. That's just a business transfer, he said quickly. Sophie shook her head slowly. Not exactly. She zoomed in on the recipient information. A bank located overseas, the Cayman Islands. My stomach tightened. Offshore transfers are rarely innocent when they come from accounts connected to stolen property. Jonathan Pierce adjusted his glasses and studied the screen carefully. That account, he said quietly, was opened under a shell company. Sophie nodded. Yes, a company created 3 months ago. Victor's voice rose slightly. Plenty of people create companies. Sophie met his eyes calmly. Of course they do, but most people don't create companies under false addresses. The room went quiet again. Diana Hale stepped forward with visible irritation. This is harassment, she snapped. Victor was planning investments. Sophie closed another window on the laptop and opened a different file. Actually, she said evenly, Victor wasn't planning investments. She turned the screen again so we could see clearly. A purchase agreement appeared. Airline tickets, one way, 3 passengers, destination, Switzerland, departure date tomorrow morning. Alina looked confused. Victor, we were going somewhere. Victor didn't answer her. Because now the truth was finally visible to everyone in the room. Sophie spoke quietly. Victor wasn't planning an investment. She tapped the screen once. He was planning to disappear. The words hit the room like a sudden thunderclap. Luis Romero muttered under his breath. Jonathan Pierce leaned back slightly, already understanding the legal implications. I slowly turned my head toward Victor. You were going to empty the accounts, take the loan against the house, and leave the country. Victor's silence confirmed everything. Alina stepped forward suddenly. Her voice trembled, but it was louder than before. You were going to leave me here with nothing. Victor looked at her then. For the first time since I arrived, he didn't even try to pretend kindness. You were never part of the plan, he said flatly. Alina's face went pale, but before anyone else could react, Diana spoke sharply. That's enough. All eyes turned to her. Diana Hale had been silent longer than usual, and that meant something was shifting in her mind. She stepped toward Victor slowly. You didn't tell me about Switzerland. Victor frowned. I was going to. Diana's eyes narrowed. You were going to leave me behind. Victor didn't answer. And in that moment, the room revealed something new. This entire scheme had been built on manipulation, but even the manipulators hadn't trusted each other completely. I folded my arms slowly. Interesting. Sophie closed the laptop gently. There's more, she said. Victor's head snapped up. More what? Sophie looked directly at him. Because that transfer never actually went through. Victor blinked. What do you mean? Jonathan Pierce smiled faintly. It means the bank flagged the transaction. Victor's entire posture stiffened. Sophie continued calmly. When a large transfer connected to a property dispute moves through an offshore shell company, banks tend to notify authorities. Louis looked toward the window where police lights from distant traffic flickered faintly in the night. Authorities like who? Sophie answered simply. Financial crimes investigators. Victor suddenly moved toward the door, but Luis Romero stepped in front of him immediately, not aggressively, just enough to block the path. I wouldn't try that, Luis said quietly. Victor glared at him. Move. Luis didn't move, and then something happened none of us expected. Alina spoke again. Her voice was still shaking, but there was something stronger inside it now. You're not leaving? Victor turned toward her slowly. For 3 years he had controlled her with fear and silence. But now the room had changed. The lies were exposed. The numbers had spoken. Alina stood straighter than I had seen since I arrived. You took my home, she said quietly. You took my business. You tried to take everything. Victor scoffed. You gave it to me. Alina shook her head slowly. No, she looked toward the television where the security footage had played earlier. You took it. The room fell silent again, and then we heard it. A sound from outside the house. Car doors closing, multiple car doors. Victor froze instantly. Sophie looked at her phone briefly, then she lifted her eyes toward me. That would be the financial crimes unit. Jonathan Pierce stood calmly and adjusted his jacket. Diana Hale's face had turned completely pale. Victor looked like a man who had finally reached the end of a very long lie. because the truth was no longer just inside this room. It had arrived outside the front door. And the moment those investigators walked into the house, everything Victor Hale had built over the past 3 years would collapse permanently. But none of us knew yet that one final secret hidden inside the estate records would shock even the investigators themselves. Because Victor hadn't just stolen money from this house. He had unknowingly triggered the one clause I designed 16 years ago that would take everything away from him in a single moment. And the moment Jonathan Pierce explained that clause to the officers, Victor Hale would realize he had been trapped from the very beginning. When the sound of car doors closing echoed outside the mansion, something inside the room shifted permanently. For 3 years, Victor Hale had controlled this house through intimidation, manipulation, and lies. But the moment those cars arrived, the illusion of control he had built started collapsing piece by piece. I have always believed one thing: patience is the most powerful weapon against lies. And that night, patience was finally delivering its reward. Victor stood frozen near the hallway, his eyes darting toward the front door like a man calculating impossible escape routes. Diana Hale had gone completely silent. For the first time since I walked into that house, the elegant composure she had worn like armor had disappeared. Elena stood beside me, her breathing uneven but her posture stronger than before. The girl who had spent 3 years shrinking herself inside her own home was slowly beginning to stand again. A knock came at the door. Firm, official. Luis Romero walked toward it calmly. For 20 years he had protected this estate quietly, and now it seemed like he had been waiting for this moment as long as I had. When he opened the door, 2 investigators stepped inside. They carried the quiet authority of people who deal with financial crimes every day. One of them, a tall woman with sharp eyes and a tablet in her hand, spoke first. "Victor Hale?" Victor didn't answer immediately. His throat tightened as if the words had suddenly become difficult to produce. Jonathan Pierce stepped forward slightly. "I'm Jonathan Pierce," he said calmly, "legal counsel for Margaret Lawson." The investigator nodded politely. "We received a notification from the bank regarding a suspicious international transfer connected to this property." Victor finally found his voice. "This is ridiculous," he snapped. "That was a private transaction." Sophie Bennett closed her laptop slowly. "It stopped being private the moment it triggered fraud alerts." The investigator looked at Victor again. "Sir, we just need to ask a few questions." Victor tried to laugh it off again. "You can't just walk into someone's home like this." Jonathan Pierce calmly slid a document across the coffee table. "Actually, they can. Especially when that home is tied to a property fraud investigation." The investigator picked up the document and scanned it briefly. Then she looked back at Victor. "Mr. Hale, we're also aware that you recently attempted to secure a loan against this property." Victor said nothing. "The problem," she continued, "is that according to the property records we reviewed on our way here, you don't legally own this house." Victor's entire face went rigid. "That's not true." That was the moment Jonathan Pierce opened the final folder he had brought with him. "It is," he said calmly. "And there's something else you should know." The investigator looked toward him. Jonathan placed a thick document on the table, the original estate agreement. The one I had signed 16 years earlier when I first transferred the mansion to Elena. "Mrs. Lawson built a protective clause into the property deed," Jonathan explained. "One designed specifically for situations like this." The investigator raised an eyebrow. "What kind of clause?" Jonathan's voice remained steady. "If the property was ever transferred under coercion, manipulation, or during a period of medical vulnerability, the ownership automatically reverts to Margaret Lawson until the dispute is resolved in court." The room went silent again. Victor stared at the document like someone seeing a trap too late to escape. "That's impossible," he muttered. Jonathan shook his head slightly. "It's very possible. In fact, it already happened." Victor looked up sharply. "What do you mean?" Jonathan folded his hands calmly. "The moment we confirmed the footage showing Elena signing under pressure, the clause activated automatically." The investigator nodded slowly as she understood the implication. "Which means the property legally reverted back to Mrs. Lawson." I looked directly at Victor. 3 hours ago." Victor's face drained of color. "No," Sophie Bennett added quietly, "which also means every financial transaction you made using the house as collateral was unauthorized." The investigator looked down at her tablet again. Including the loan application submitted yesterday. Victor's breathing grew heavier now. You're twisting things, he said weakly. Alina agreed to everything. Alina stepped forward then, her voice trembled but her words were clear. No, I didn't. Everyone in the room turned toward her. She looked directly at Victor now. For years he had made her feel invisible, powerless, small, but something inside her had changed tonight. You told me if I didn't sign those papers you would leave me with nothing, she said quietly. You told me my mother abandoned me, you told me I was lucky you stayed. Victor said nothing. Alina took another step forward. But you didn't stay for me, she continued. You stayed for the house. The investigator turned toward Victor again. Mr. Hale, based on the financial evidence and the property clause that has now been confirmed, we're going to need you to come with us for further questioning. Victor's shoulders slumped slightly. Diana finally spoke again, her voice brittle now. This is outrageous. We will fight this in court. Jonathan Pierce smiled faintly. You're welcome to try. Luis Romero stood quietly near the doorway watching the entire scene unfold. The man who had silently witnessed Alina's suffering for 3 years was finally seeing justice begin to arrive. Victor looked around the room one last time. The television screen where the footage had played. The laptop full of financial records. The documents proving the house was never truly his. And Alina standing there no longer afraid. 2 investigators stepped forward. Mr. Hale, one of them said firmly. Please come with us? Victor didn't resist, because deep down he knew the truth. The plan he had spent 3 years building had collapsed in a single evening, but the biggest shock was still waiting for him. Because when the investigators finished reviewing Sophie Bennett's financial report, they would discover that Victor Hale's fraud extended far beyond this house. And the charges he was about to face would change the rest of his life forever. When the investigators led Victor Hale out of the living room, the mansion felt quieter than it had in years. The sound of the front door closing behind them echoed through the hallway like the end of a long storm. In 64 years of life, I have learned something powerful about truth. When truth finally arrives, it doesn't shout. It simply stands there and everything false begins to fall away on its own. Victor didn't fight as they escorted him outside. The confidence he had worn like a tailored suit all evening had vanished completely. Diana Hale stood frozen near the fireplace, her elegant posture finally crumbling under the weight of everything that had been exposed. For years, she had been the quiet architect of this scheme, the woman whispering strategy behind Victor's charm. But now even she understood the game was over. One of the investigators paused before leaving and turned toward Jonathan Pierce. Mr. Hale will be questioned tonight, she said. Based on the financial records Miss Bennett provided, we'll also be opening a larger fraud investigation. Sophie Bennett closed her laptop calmly. You'll want to review the offshore transfers first, she said. That's where the real numbers start appearing. The investigator nodded once. We will. Then they stepped outside and the flashing lights from their vehicles slowly faded down the long driveway. For the first time since I had walked into the house, the room was finally still. Diana Hale was the first to move. She picked up her purse slowly, her face pale and rigid. This isn't finished, she said quietly, though the confidence was gone from her voice now. Jonathan Pierce looked at her calmly. Legally speaking, it is. Diana's eyes moved across the room, lingering on the television, the laptop, the documents scattered across the coffee table. Every piece of evidence that had dismantled her plan in a single evening. Finally, she turned toward the door without another word and walked out. The silence she left behind felt completely different from the silence that had filled this house earlier. That earlier silence had been built from fear. This one felt like something new, like space finally opening again. Alina was still standing beside me. My daughter hadn't spoken since Victor was taken away. Slowly, she walked across the room toward the window where she had spent so many evenings quietly cleaning the floor. She looked down at the mop bucket still sitting near the wall. For 3 years, that bucket had been a symbol of everything she believed she had lost. Luis Romero stepped forward quietly and picked it up. You won't be needing this anymore, he said gently. Alina looked at him, and something inside her expression softened for the first time that night. Then she turned toward me. Mama, her voice broke slightly. For a moment she looked like the same little girl who used to run around our old apartment rearranging chairs and curtains just to make the space feel more beautiful. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her. For 3 years she had been living inside a lie designed to convince her she had nothing left. But the truth was something Victor and Diana had never understood. Alina Lawson had never truly lost anything that mattered. She had simply been surrounded by people who wanted her to believe she had. Jonathan Pierce cleared his throat gently. "Margaret," he said, "there's one more thing we should discuss." I turned toward him. "The property records," he nodded. "The protective clause activated earlier tonight. Legally speaking, the house reverted to your ownership the moment the coercion was confirmed." Alina looked at me quickly. "Does that mean?" I smiled softly and took her hand. "It means the house is safe again." Sophie Bennett added quietly, "And once the fraud investigation is complete, the stolen funds can likely be recovered." Alina looked around the living room slowly. The same room where she had been forced to clean the floor hours earlier. The same room where Victor and Diana had treated her like she didn't belong. But now the atmosphere had changed completely. Louis stood near the doorway with a small smile on his face. Jonathan was calmly organizing the legal documents. Sophie was closing her laptop after finishing the final financial notes. And Alina stood taller than she had since I arrived. "I thought I had lost everything," she whispered. I squeezed her hand gently. "You didn't lose everything?" She looked at me again, tears forming in her eyes. "I lost myself?" I shook my head slowly. "No," I said softly, "you just forgot who you were." Outside, the night air had grown quiet. The police vehicles were gone. The flashing lights had disappeared from the driveway. The house no longer felt like a prison. It felt like a home again. Alina walked slowly toward the staircase, looking up at the second floor where her bedroom had once been. "I haven't slept up there in 2 years," she said quietly. Louis frowned. "Where were you sleeping?" Alina hesitated. Then she gestured toward a small hallway door near the kitchen, a storage room. The realization hit all of us at the same time. Jonathan muttered something under his breath. Sophie's expression hardened slightly. I walked over to Alina and placed my hand gently on her shoulder. "That ends tonight." Alina nodded slowly. Then she looked back at the living room, the house she had been forced to believe she no longer owned. And for the first time since I had returned home, she smiled. Not the fragile smile of someone trying to survive a difficult moment. A real one, the kind that comes from finally understanding something important. "Mama," she said softly, "I think it's time I start over." I smiled back at her. "Not start over," I corrected gently. "Start again." Because starting again means something very different. Starting over suggests everything before was a failure. Starting again means you take everything you learned, every mistake, every painful lesson, every moment of courage, and build something stronger with it. Alina nodded slowly, understanding exactly what I meant. Downstairs, Louis opened the windows and let the cool night air flow through the house. The scent of the garden drifted inside again, carrying the faint smell of the purple flowers Alina loved so much. Jonathan finished organizing the documents and placed them neatly back into his briefcase. "I'll finalize the legal filings tomorrow morning," he said. "After that, everything will officially be restored." Sophie Bennett slung her laptop bag over her shoulder. "And I'll continue tracking the financial recovery," she added. One by one, the people who had helped reveal the truth began preparing to leave. But before they walked out, they all paused in the living room for a moment. Because they could see it too, this house had finally changed. Not because the walls were different, not because the furniture had moved, but because the lie that had lived inside it for 3 years was finally gone. Alina stood beside me in the center of the room, looking around quietly. "It feels different," she said softly. I nodded. "That's because it finally belongs to the right person again." Later that night, after everyone had gone, Alina and I sat together in the living room where the whole story had unfolded. The same room where she had once been forced to kneel and scrub the floor. The same room where Victor Hale thought he controlled everything, but he had made one fatal mistake. He underestimated patience. And patience had been waiting for 16 years. Alina rested her head on my shoulder the way she used to when she was younger. "Mama," she whispered, "thank you for coming home." I looked around the mansion one last time before turning off the lights. The house I had built for my daughter had finally come home again. In this time, no one would ever take it from her.